Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello. Hi, Lolade. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Natalia. And you?
Good, thank you. So should I be seeing something on the chat function? I see I can use it, and I got the message from Todd.
Okay.
And yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's just for the panelists.
Perfect.
Just waiting to see. Has Todd joined us? Yes. Okay. Apologies. Okay. It's 1:59, 60 seconds to our start time. But I once again welcome everyone who has already joined us to today's session, which is the second in our series of webinars under the I-September series. The I-September series is powered by the Investigations, Compliance, and Ethics Practice Group of Udodom and Belo-Osagie. My name is Lolade Oshosami. I am a partner in Udodom and Belo-Osagie's Taxation and Compliance and Investigations teams, and I will be your moderator for this session. The theme for this panel session is New Landscape for Corporate Policies. This session will explore how the corporate ecosystem is evolving in a post-pandemic era and issues that are shaping policy development and implementation. And to discuss these issues today are our panelists, whom I will introduce, starting with Mr. Todd Fotopoulos. Mr. Todd Fotopoulos is an attorney at Butler Snow LP. He will be bringing the North American perspective to the topic of to today's topic. His profile is displayed on the screen, and I will also like to introduce Ms. Talita Lopsha, who is a partner at Bowman's law firm. She will be bringing a South African perspective to today's discussion, and her profile is also displayed on the screen. Joining us also, or with us this afternoon from Europe, is Ms. Natalia Oliveira Costa, a researcher, teaching associate, and PhD candidate at the Institute of Austrian and International Tax Law of the Vienna University of Economics and Business. Also on the panel with us today is Dr. Nelson Anumaka. Dr. Anumaka is the director and head of the Directorate of Corporate Governance Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria. And last but certainly not the least is our senior partner, Mr. Daniel Agbo, who is also the chairman of UAC PLC, which is the oldest conglomerate in Nigeria. Mr. Agbo's profile is displayed on the screen. So without further ado, we will try and jump into the discussions for today. And today we are ambitious, and we have set our completion time for this session to a maximum of 1 hour to 1 hour, 15 minutes. So for those who have tuned in early, thank you once again, you're welcome. So today's session, we have 3 subsets within today's session. We're going to look at 3 corporate policies. And we're looking at those policies in the context of the theme of this year's ICE series, which is the new norm. And starting today, we're going to talk about succession planning policy. And I'm going to pose questions to our panelists. And we're going to start with Dr. Anumaka. Dr. Anumaka is from the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, regulators of the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance. So Dr. Anumaka, you're welcome once again. And starting with you, we'd like you to please share with our audience, what is a succession planning policy? What you consider, what you mean by a succession planning policy from a corporate governance perspective? And what is the objective behind the FRS's recommendation that companies should have one?
Thank you very much. The succession plan policy is just a key element of good corporate governance of a company, and is also known as replacement plan policy that ensures that business continue to run smoothly after a company's most important board members or senior management staff move on to new opportunities or retire, or maybe leave the company or pass away even. It's a thing that a company should adopt, and that is why it was also enshrined in the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance. If you look at Principle 1 of Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance, it talks about the establishment and implementation of a succession plan, and the appointment processes, training, mechanisms, and the remuneration structure for both the board members and the senior management of every organization. And that is why even the chair of the board, also the committees chairs, and then the CEO of the organizations, plus the executive directors, these are the people, important people that matter a lot in the company, that they had to be this succession planning. If we look at what happened in the recent past, the COVID-19 pandemic and its attendant impact, it highlights the increasing urgency, really, which family-owned businesses are expected to make adequate provisions for succession planning, because nobody knows what could happen at any point in time. We saw that even some people left, gave up the ghost untimely like that. So when they are about to retire and without instituting any governance structure, they just place their children as a managing director or CEO, or even the chairman of the board. And meanwhile, they do not have basic training and preparation for such top-level appointment. And what is the result? The result is usually a recipe or a disaster. And we do not want companies to fail. And that is why it was enshrined in the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance. So successful businesses having only one man risk may be deeply hurt, and they will be unable to recover if the founder of that business or the critical person exits that company. So the board must satisfy itself that plans are in place for orderly succession for appointments to the board and to senior management positions, so that they can maintain appropriate balance of skills, experience, culture, and all within the company and on the board. So essentially, this is why it was really provided in the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance, and you can properly see it in our Principle 1 of the code. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anumaka. Your response, you mentioned family businesses. And that leads me to another question, because the impression that most people have is that when it comes to complying with the corporate governance code, it's an obligation that is suited more to public companies than privately owned businesses, especially family businesses. Do you want to comment on the appropriateness of the code with regard to its recommendation for succession planning for private businesses, family businesses, even small businesses for that matter?
Yes, I want to comment because the code itself is a principle-based code, and there is flexibility in the code and there is scalability in the code, irrespective of the sizes of the businesses. You should be encouraged, even if you are not within the scope of the code, you should be encouraged to start doing something, because you never can know. The company can graduate into a public limited liability company tomorrow. And our vision was that the code of corporate governance for every company, we should see it as our DNAs, not just because it is being regulated or just that there is a code. We want everybody to participate. If you look at most businesses in Nigeria, especially those family businesses or small or what they call private companies that had failed completely or ceased to exist, it is because there was no succession plan policy. I give you an example. When we were very young, my father, they used to buy tires from, is it Odutola company? And I know when I was in secondary school or primary school, they used to take us to Bata or Lelands to buy shoes. Those companies are no longer there. But can we compare them with companies like Heineken, Guinness, Leventis, and so on and so forth, that has presence in over 200 and something countries in the world? But they were like family businesses. But today they are growing, and they have so grown that because they have succession planning, and then it is not a matter for their children to manage or their family members to manage, rather they were all trained. If we also come to professional firms, Akintola Williams is a typical example that transformed to Deloitte. Now you can see it's still there, and then it's waxing strong. It's amongst the big four in the country. We can also talk about Rotimi Williams and Co, Ganifa Wemine, all of them. They're there because some of those people put in place succession plan policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Numaka. I'll come back to you. And it's interesting, the examples that you shared in the course of responding to that question, because we have sitting with us on the panel today, Mr. Agbo, our senior partner at Udodom and Belo-Osagie, who has successfully implemented a succession plan in the professional services sector, as well as in the corporate sector. And it would be interesting to hear his own views, especially in relation to how he was able to implement those plans successfully. So Mr. Agbo, if you could please just share with us, continuing from where Dr. Numaka stopped, and help us to understand the importance of a succession plan in the context of a public company and a private organization in a professional services sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Lade. I think that in my day job, as I would probably describe it, as a practicing lawyer, it was, or it has been necessary for me to familiarize myself with the provisions of the 2018 Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance. And there's lots of really useful and interesting stuff in that code, including the recommendation about the recommendation that the board of directors establish a succession plan. But leaving aside whether or not this is in a code, I think this is really just good business sense and in many ways common sense, because unless you're unless you're a sole practitioner or running your own business, and you have no plans to either hand over the business to the next generation, sell the business. These are all good things to do. It's both important and profitable to think about who you're going to hand over the business to, what you need to do in relation to get that person ready to take over either the leadership of the company or specific roles in the company, and what the timing is going to be. So at a basic level of good business sense, before I was already managing partner of the law firm before I became chairman of UAC of Nigeria. So at a basic level of client service, at a basic level of common sense, the importance of succession planning was really already apparent to me. When I joined the board of UAC, when I began to chair the board of UAC, there was an amazing coincidence in timing, because we were dealing with CEO succession in this entity, which is both Nigeria's oldest company and Nigeria's oldest conglomerate, at the same time that we were dealing with my own succession as managing partner in the firm. And a couple of things struck me. A couple of commonalities struck me that I'll share with you. So the first thing I would say that succession, whether in the private sector, as in companies or a professional services firm, first thing that they have in common is both sort of whether a company or law firm partnership are driven by profit. Lola, I would imagine that ultimately we are driven by profit. Todd, I guess Talita?
Totally agree.
Even though we don't tell our clients that, we are ultimately driven by profit. And so therefore we do the things that we need to do. We put in place these succession plans in order to ensure the continued stream of profits, both in the law firm and in the PLC. But succession planning, and I speak here across both types of institutions, succession planning doesn't begin, in my view, with succession. Succession planning begins with recruitment and talent. And that was something that, I've always known at an instinctive level that how important talent is. But it's actually more obvious in a law firm, because talent in a professional services firm is everything. Talent is the basis on which you provide good legal advice to your clients. And so with a company where, for instance, we make, at least more accurately, our subsidiaries make paints, and our subsidiaries make gala, and our subsidiaries make animal feeds, you can very often lose sight of how important the search in talent is. And so this struck me across both, that the succession planning actually begins with the need to identify and recruit and retain talent, because it is this talent that is ultimately going to assume leadership roles in the organization. So that's the first thing. So if you're looking for talent, there is no room for, I almost said friendship, which is the colloquial way that I typically describe it. But there's no room for favoritism, and there's no room for favorites. It's about who can deliver. And so Dr. Numaka talked about these family companies that in Nigeria that have survived. And they've survived because some of these entities have looked for talent within the gene pool of the founders, not found it in specific roles, and haven't hesitated to bring in outside leadership where required. So if you look at the CEO, for instance, of Leventis, the Leventis group in Nigeria, there is no Leventis in his or her surname, and probably no Leventis in his or her DNA. And then there are numerous examples like that. So talent is my big thing, and this cuts across both a listed company and a professional services firm. So talent, no favoritism, and the third thing is actually starting early. So one of the things that COVID has done is COVID has heightened mortality risk. So again, at a level of common sense, we always knew that, I guess my partners always knew that I could walk out the door and get hit by a bus on the way home. The other thing, the big thing that COVID has done now is that COVID doesn't wait for the bus. You can say hi and bye to someone on a Friday evening, and on a Monday you get a message that he or she who was occupying a leadership role has gone. And so COVID has made the need for succession planning even more urgent and even more important. The other thing I would say that COVID did, and this is in relation to both types of organizations, I would actually say the other thing that COVID did, and just this cuts across both types of organizations. I think that COVID has changed the type of person that one would be looking for in terms of succession. So before COVID, this world was proceeding on a fairly predictable trajectory. I still remember having a conversation with someone, one of my partners, who made a very, I think I was still managing partner at the time, who spoke very passionately about the merits of working from home. And I said, cherish the thought. You surely cannot be as productive working from home as you would be in the office. Fast forward to 2020, and and we all worked from home for most of 2020. So COVID means that the sort of person you need in your succession, you need in the pipeline for succession, is someone who can adapt to change in a rapid manner. And that wasn't quite the same thing beforehand, because businesses were proceeding on the basis of a fairly steady state. So Lolade, those are the things I've sort of found that, I've seen that here in the law firm. I've seen that in UAC about, every single thing I've said, I encountered in both places. And so it has struck me that actually succession is not that different, whether you're dealing with a listed entity or you're dealing with a professional services firm. So those are my comments for that.
Thank you very much. And the question I want to ask next, Mr. Agbo, is, do you think succession planning should be regulated?
I think that, okay, I think the short answer is I think it is a matter of common sense. Okay. And so, because it is a matter of common sense, I am by nature, I favor light touch regulation as opposed to regulation of another variety. So do I think it should be the subject of recommendation, which is what is in the code right now? Yes, certainly, I think it should be the subject of a recommendation. Do I think it needs to be, there needs to be anything more than that? I don't think so. Look, at an investor level, investors are very sensible. Okay, investors see risk, and so I think that if there is a process where analysts focus on the quality of an institution's succession plan, or succession planning to be more accurate, and air their views, I think that a rational investor will vote with his or her feet, either in the direction of an institution that does have these things in place, or as far away as possible as he, she, or it can get from such institution. So again, so my view is, I don't think it should be regulated beyond where we are now.
Thank you. Thanks for those insights. Dr. Anumaka, coming back to you, I would like you to please share with us what you've seen with regard to the level of compliance and what the expectation of the FRC is also from organizations with regard to this particular policy that you have recommended.
Thank you very much. Like I said before, the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance is a principle-based code. So everything within it is like a judgmental thing. Therefore, we have attempted to do compliance and monitoring through the sector regulators. We had a problem in 2016. I'm sure you are aware that we churned out some 3 codes that time, one for private sector, one for public sector, and one for not-for-profit organizations. It became contentious in the country. And one of the major contentions was that it was mandatory, and also it was prescriptive. That was why in handling this one that came out now as Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance, we attempted to make it a principle-based code where board members and the top management will always use their judgment. But what I will say is that the code philosophy is apply and explain. And we have 28 principles embedded in that code, about 247 recommended practices. And what apply and explain philosophy means is that we assume that in the corporate governance journey of every company, they should apply all the principles and explain them as they have applied them. Or if there is anyone they may have imported. And that's why it's principle-based, because you may have something that is peculiar to you, then nothing stops you from doing that, but we need explanations for what you are doing. In terms of monitoring and enforcement, we do it through sector regulators, because that time also people contended that FRC was high-handed and they were dishing out high penalties and all that. So this time around, we said, okay, let the sector regulators review along with us after we had churned out the templates, and then monitor and enforce compliance within their sectors. But it is our responsibility to oversee what the sector regulators are doing. So we are liaising on a regular daily basis with the sector regulators in terms of compliance. Within this period, 2020 and part of 2021, that nearly all the companies had submitted their reports. We discovered that we are still not there yet, because a lot of them, they were supposed to answer yes or no and then explain. They didn't do so. And then some companies left a lot of reporting questions unanswered. And that leaves us, as reviewers, it leaves us to believe that either the subject matter does not apply to the company, or they do not have documentations or structures in place for it. They will believe that the implementation is evolving, that the monitoring, the compliance mechanisms, they are evolving. So we didn't say it will be error-free. So we expected there may be issues and challenges, but we are optimistic because we have been doing consistent education. In fact, right now, we have taken up all the universities in this country. We have dealt with the federal universities. We have dealt with the state universities. The next one is the private universities, so that everybody should imbibe this concept of corporate governance. So we are optimistic that as the implementation and reporting advances, the compliance learning curve will progressively improve. So that's our belief. And we are doing our best from our own end to educate through seminars, workshops, and all that. Like even today, what we are doing today also, I'm sure those of the viewers and participants, they are listening to us, they will go back and adjust their seatbelts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anumaka. You know, one thing that I picked from your responses and those of Mr. Abo also is that succession planning is something that it cannot be spontaneous. An organization must have a plan, and a plan that is carefully thought through, and implementation must start early. So I imagine that recognizing talent is the key, is the first step to having a successful succession plan. Now, there are certain challenges that we are facing in this post-pandemic era, which we didn't have previously. And one of such challenges is the challenge of the lack of proximity. And that brings us to the second policy that we're going to be discussing this afternoon, which is the remote work policy. Of course, we know that since the pandemic, flexible working arrangements, which sparsely, at least in our jurisdiction, existed, had to become the default position for most organizations who wanted to stay afloat. But that has come with all manner of challenges, one of which is the inability to effectively inculcate the corporate culture of an organization into individuals, particularly the middle cadre and you know, the newcomers into the organization. So it becomes more challenging to easily and quickly identify budding talent within the organization. We're going to talk about the need for organizations to have remote working policies, especially now in a post-pandemic era. I'm not even sure whether it's correct to say post-pandemic, but COVID has come. We've seen the worst of it, I believe. It's being tempered now by the vaccines, and hopefully, you know, globally will overcome the challenge. But focusing now on the need for a remote working policy, I would like to direct some questions at Tatiana and Natalia. And so Tatiana, the question for you this afternoon is, what is the trend in your jurisdiction? You have come from South Africa, and we'd like you to share what your experience has been in South Africa regarding remote working, and to also tell us whether having a remote work policy has somewhat become a mandatory requirement in your jurisdiction. We know that South Africa in particular has suffered a great bout of the COVID-19 pandemic, and even now, I'm not sure that companies have fully opened their doors to physical work. So would like to know what your experience is from a South African perspective. Tatiana.
Thanks a lot, Luladi. Yeah, it is great to be with all of you. Thank you very much. It is not a mandatory requirement to have a work from home or remote working policy, but it is definitely something that we strongly recommend that employers have. Normally, under normal circumstances, you would identify the location where the employee would work. And COVID came and it changed that rapidly. So yes, it is important not only to deal with the fact that the company can require you to work from a different location, but it is also important to build into that policy the flexibility to revoke that work from a different location and to require employees to now come back to the office again. And I think that there is a level of anxiousness currently in South Africa to get people back in the office. 18 months is a long time to be working remotely. And I don't think that we are really feeling the problems of remote working necessarily in productivity. I think, employees have shown that they can work remotely, and for the most part, they are reliable. It is the people who were not pulling their weight while they were in the office that were not pulling their weight while they were at home. And things like performance management was definitely a challenge in those cases. But I think you touched on it, Luladi. It's the soft things that are really impacting on organizations, and it is team cohesion and the ability to feel that you belong, especially amongst junior employees. And I think that is part of why companies are now pushing for employees to come back. Of course, in relation to remote working, it really also depends on the type of work that we are talking about. And it also depends on the level of connectivity that there might be for the employee concerned to be able to work remotely. And for that reason, our regulations have allowed for a hybrid model where employees could actually work from the office, for example, where in circumstances where they just simply couldn't do their work remotely because there isn't sufficient internet access or electricity or those kinds of challenges. But then, of course, with heavy regulations regarding adequate space, the taking of special measures for people who are over 60 or those with comorbidities, and so on. Another big challenge, of course, is safety and the employer's obligation to ensure a safe work environment, and exactly how far that extends when you are working from a remote location. Is it the employer's job to give you a chair that is not going to hurt your back, or is that your obligation? What's the employer's liability in relation to you falling off, the stairs to your flat? Or also, actually more poignantly, things like confidentiality and the protection of the company's confidential information. What is happening to that when you have files and files now at home rather than at the office? Also things like cybersecurity, which is spiking now in the pandemic, and how can employers make sure that these systems are now safe? So yeah, I think there's been a lot of challenges for employers, and a lot of quick thinking and creative thinking and simply, adapting to the changes, but they have come at a cost. And, it is also now for employers to sit back and think carefully about the categories of employees who ought to come back to work, perhaps the regularity of that return to work. Is it 2 days a week, 3 days a week? And balancing all of that with the need for a safe work environment where people are not exposed to COVID.
Thanks, Talita. I'm so sorry. I christened you Tatiana for a minute there. Sincere apologies for that. You know, your response has thrown up issues that are critical to the developing of an efficient remote work policy, employment law issues, data protection issues. So I want you to please enlighten us a bit about how to the extent to which organizations can stretch the employer-employee contractual relations. So you have an employee who refuses to come physically to the office because they're scared of contracting COVID, but the very nature of their function requires that they come to the office physically. Can the organization force such a person to come to the office physically? Or does the employee have rights that he or she can enforce against the organization? How should organizations balance this sort of risks? Talita? Have we lost Talita?
I'm back. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. All of a sudden, I was just gone.
Don't worry.
Sorry, if you
it's a virtual world now, so we understand. Did you hear the question?
I didn't. If you can please repeat it.
Okay. So I said your response threw up issues of employment law, data protection, and all manner of critical issues that organizations need to take into consideration when trying to develop a remote work policy. And so I gave an example of where you have an employee who is really afraid, terrified even, of coming to the workplace physically, but whose function require that they be in the office physically. As an organization, how can you balance that? Can you force the employee to come to the office? If you terminate the employee on the grounds of refusing to come to the office, are there rights that the employee can enforce against the organization? Have you seen this sort of things come to play since this COVID era?
Yeah, we have seen it, Luladi, and I think the big thing is that you need to engage with that employee and understand the reasons for that fear. The legislation makes a difference between vulnerable employees and highly vulnerable employees, and it also has to do not only with comorbidities that the employee may have or age, but also with the type of work that the employee is performing. You know, so in circumstances where the employee is working in a hospital, for example, and it's exposed to these kinds of illnesses all the time, that is different to an employee sitting in an office by herself or himself, not seeing any colleagues really during the course of the day and going home again, you know, hardly spoken to anybody except the security guard at the gate. So it is, you know, in that sense, there needs to be a balancing of these interests and making sure that you understand what is the reason for this fear, because this employee might be in a high-risk situation on account of comorbidities. And in those circumstances also, the legislation doesn't say you may not come to the office. The legislation says the employer needs to take reasonably practicable steps to make it safe by way of the now normal measures like adequate space, hand sanitizing, mask wearing, but also special measures like a surgical mask or a mask plus a visor, or if there is contact with the public, a perspex divider between that person and the public. And then if the employee refuses and there are these measures in place, then actually the employer can issue an instruction and say you ought to come to work, and then take disciplinary steps if the person doesn't. But isn't that clear? And it is very interesting to me that we don't have more guidance on this from government yet, is the impact of the vaccine. Because what we definitely are seeing is that hospitalizations are less, and that the number of people who've had the vaccine versus people who haven't had the vaccine, the percentages are definitely lower when it comes to mortality rates. And we are taking the view that having had the vaccine is actually a special measure, because it's an added level of protection for that person, and it makes it easier to require those people to come back to work. So it is very interesting how all of these things just, come into the same pot, and it is rights and obligations that need to be weighed up all along. And it is difficult to just have a blanket answer. You actually need to engage with each of these specific instances.
Interesting. And perhaps organizations must now also consider how to structure their employment contracts to take these issues into consideration, and of course, when developing a policy as well. Thanks very much, Talita. Still on the issue of remote working policy, there are several risks. We've heard Talita share some of them. Another risk that was triggered, especially in the early days of the pandemic, are tax risks, which I would have Natalia speak to us about. All of a sudden, remote working sparked controversy about tax exposure of organizations and also employees. So Natalia, if you can please share with us some of those risks, those tax risks that employers and employees faced in the wake of the pandemic, and how organizations can mitigate these risks when designing a remote working policy.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Lolade. It's a pleasure to be here. So when designing a remote working policy, companies definitely need to take into account the tax risks. So there are two main things that you need to consider, especially in a cross-border context when your employees are working from home. So if you have a company in country A and your employee is sitting in country B, C, D, that's when the risks are going to be triggered. So I'm going to address mainly two risks, which is the permanent establishment risk and the risk of dual residency, of both for companies and employees. So first, related to the permanent establishment risk, to explain, as a general rule, the profits of a company will be taxed in the country where the company is a resident. Only in that country. An exception to this rule is if the company is considered to have a permanent establishment in another country. So in a scenario where a Nigerian company has employees working abroad, or the other way around, a UK company or a US company has employees working in Nigeria, the tax authority of that country where the employee is working from home can understand that the home office of the employee is a permanent establishment of that company. So what happens in these situations is that the country where the employee is sitting might want to tax the profits of the company. So obviously this is a risk, and it comes for compliance burdens for the company. So the company might have to register for tax purposes, might have to file tax returns, etc., and split the profits of the company to account for the local regulations in the other country as well. So this is a risk for generally any employee, let's put it this way, that is sitting outside of the country where the company is. And then another risk, which is probably more relevant for the senior management of the company, is that you can also form a permanent establishment in another country if directors, CEOs, or decision makers in general are sitting outside of the country and habitually concluding or negotiating contracts on behalf of the company. So in this sense, it's even more relevant for these employees, so the senior management, to take that into account. Another risk is also connected, but is the change of residency of the company or the employee. So what happens is, as I mentioned, the country where the company is a tax resident will have the taxing rights over the profits of that company. And depending on where that company is considered to be a resident. So depending on where the senior management is sitting, where the board of directors are taking place, where the strategic decisions of that company are being taken, that can be a determinant factor for one country to decide that that company is a resident for tax purposes in their country. So what happens is that under domestic law, maybe two countries will want to tax the profits of that company. So putting in other words, risk of double taxation, which we all want to avoid, obviously. So under a double tax treaty, there can only be one country to tax that profits, and it comes down to a tiebreaker rule, which usually is depending the place of effective management. So what is really important to take into consideration are the factors that I mentioned, such as where the board of director meetings are taking place, where the senior management of the company is most of the time sitting, etc. And then also associated to that, we've been talking about companies, but this is also a risk for employees. So if you're an employee and you decide to work remotely abroad, maybe you go back to your home country, or maybe you want to work, I don't know, in a beach in the Caribbean, you also might be considered a tax resident in another country. So similarly, maybe two countries under their domestic law will feel entitled to tax the income from your employment, so your salary, your bonuses, and this triggers issues both, or concerns, let's put it this way, both for companies and employees, because companies, for one side, usually have the obligation to withhold the personal income tax of that employee. So in a scenario where the employee is actually liable for paying taxes in a different country, what would happen? So would the company have to withhold and then refund the employee for the taxes, or would the company have to file taxes in a different country or in many different countries? So this is an issue that probably companies need to think about, and we're expecting, in light of the remote working becoming or the new norm, we're expecting tax regulators to also issue some guidelines relating to this. I think it's important to say that during COVID, so during the pandemic, the OECD, which is the main organization that issues guidelines related to international tax, they pronounced that due to exceptional circumstances and force majeure, the time that someone spends abroad in a different country should not be used as a threshold to form a permanent establishment or as the basis to change the residency of the company or of the employee. So this is not in a lot of countries, not just the OECD, but we saw here in Europe, Austria, or then Australia, I think South Africa as well. A lot of countries issued guidelines saying we are not going to consider employees that are sitting that are working from our jurisdiction. We are not going to try to tax that profit if that employee would not be here if it wasn't because of the pandemic. So this is not so much of an issue, let's put it this way, during the pandemic. But of course, we know that even after the pandemic, a lot of people will want to work from home, and companies are coming up with remote working policies. So this is more relevant after the pandemic ends, hopefully soon. So yeah, so that's a summary of the issues that we need to consider.
Thanks very much, Natalia. You've done a great job of summarizing a very complex issue and simplifying it for our audience. And I think just to put things in perspective, in relation to today's topic, it would be necessary for organizations to take these issues into consideration when designing a remote working policy. Because like Natalia said, it seems remote working definitely has come to stay. And most organizations are going to have a hybrid model at the end of the day. I recall at the time of the pandemic that some organizations, in spite of the OECD guidelines, were still very nervous and were calling their employees to come back to the jurisdiction where the companies had its operations. We did have a couple of UK companies at the time insisting that their employees had to come back to the UK to work from home in the UK. So you could work from home, but technically you couldn't leave the country. So these are the sorts of restrictions that organizations may need to work into a remote working policy, because we know that it's only a matter of time that tax authorities also would want to cash in on this sort of developments. So thank you very much, Talita and Natalia. Talita, when you were talking, you talked about vaccines, and I think that's the white elephant in the room right now across jurisdictions. How do organizations respond to people's attitudes towards vaccination? And today we have with us Todd, who is from the United States, and who is going to share with us recent developments on this issue in the US. And I'll just have him let us know what's going on, and then I'll pose one question to him. But in the meantime, I'd like to also encourage our attendees to please post your questions in the Q&A box. I don't think I see any questions there yet. So please, the Q&A box is open. Post your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box, please. Thank you. Over to you, Todd.
Thank you so much, Lalade. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today. Greetings from Memphis, Tennessee in the United States, the home of Elvis, and most recently, Justin Timberlake, if you are pop music fans of US music. So I have no musical talent. Instead, I practice law here in the States and enjoy advising US employers and multinational companies that are trying to bring individuals into the United States. A big part of my practice is focused on US business immigration policy, which of course is a practice that's based in large part on global mobility. So to say the least, the pandemic has substantially altered the way that we are practicing and what we're advising our clients on. And a lot of the issues that my colleagues on the panel today have talked about have been issues of significant concern in U.S. government policy, as well as for U.S. employers. And it's been a very interesting dance with science trying to lead the way for government, which is trying to lead the way for employers, and then the slow reaction of the law and the government to the rapidly changing landscape that we're all facing has resulted in employers then trying to take things into their own hands to a large extent, really because there's just not a whole lot of guidance or law out there. It's starting to catch up, and it's starting to catch up in a significant way. I'm remembering some of Dan's words from earlier in the seminar today, talking about the rapid change in culture and workplace, and certainly that's been true here. What I've seen with the pandemic for employers and for the government has been an incubator of sorts, or an evolutionary accelerator of changes to the workplace, changes to the law. And what I'm seeing right now is a fundamental shift from I guess a kindler, gentler approach to a more mandatory approach in U.S. policy. And it's a really interesting dynamic because there are very significant variations in attitude and reception to this culturally and politically, and that has significantly impacted the rollout of these types of policies. So there's a lot of tension in the U.S. right now culturally, which manifests itself in the political landscape, and that results in tension in the government landscape. So it kind of flows up the chain where politicians are seeing different attitudes in different regions of the country and trying to respond and represent their constituents, which flows up to the types of laws and regulations that are being passed in the states. Generally speaking, in the United States, there are a lot of layers of regulation that would impact the whole COVID experience, starting with the federal government, which is the national government, if you will. And inside of the national government, there are multiple agencies that touch on issues related to the pandemic, from health and safety, from wage and hour regulations, from discriminatory practices regulations, and how to treat people with disabilities that may have different reactions to the pandemic. And then inside of that, each state, there are 50 states in the US, and each state has its own laws that impact the pandemic and how things will be treated. And then within each state, there are regional differences. So in the state of Tennessee, which is a long kind of rectangular state, about 450 miles wide, where I am in the western part of the state, the approach to the pandemic is completely different than on the eastern part of the state. And so it really does get very granular very quickly in terms of how to respond to the pandemic, what is required in terms of masking, what is required in terms of remote work, and what's required in terms of vaccine policy. So with that big backdrop in mind, the federal government about 12 days ago, through President Biden, announced a new plan that is going to significantly change U.S. policy. And it's still an evolutionary idea at this point, because while an announcement has been made, exacting regulations, which would actually define what the parameters are, have not been issued yet. So we're all waiting. Right now, where we are in the U.S. from a policy perspective is President Biden has issued what we call in the U.S. an executive order, which is something that the president can sign unilaterally without approval or passage or vote by lawmakers, and that will set policy. And this executive order that he's just recently signed on September 9th would require all U.S. employers of 100 or more employees to mandate that all of its employees be vaccinated, or mandate that all of the employees go through weekly testing for COVID, and not be able to work unless they come back with a negative test every single week. Now, many of us, probably most of us on this call, have gone through the unpleasant experience of having a vaccine test. So I can't imagine having to do that on a weekly basis. But nonetheless, I think what this is showing in the United States is a shift in attitude. Not overall. We still have a lot of a sizable group of the U.S. that is very, very resistant to the federal government telling them to do anything. To be candid. And so there's a resistance to being mandated to take a vaccine. And I think that the change of the science is trying to catch up with the illness, has exacerbated those fears and concerns. But nonetheless, I think the fundamental shift is going away from more of an incentive-based program where employers were incentivizing employees to come back to work and to get vaccinated. Now we're seeing the federal government try to step in and create more of a blanket, uniform policy for the United States that would impact all U.S. employers with 100 or more employees. Effective immediately are mandatory vaccine requirements for all employers that have federal contracts, that is, contracts with the U.S. government to provide certain services. So if you are an employer in the United States and you have a government contract, let's say you're a road contractor and you help pave roads for the federal government on U.S. highways and interstate systems, you are going to be mandated immediately, without having to wait for the regulations to come forward, to have vaccinations for your employees or go through the weekly testing. President Biden recently announced that for direct federal employees, which is a sizable group of people in the United States, there is a mandatory vaccine requirement with no ability to opt out unless you have a medical condition or a bona fide religious exemption from that requirement. So there's no testing alternative if you're a direct federal employee, an employee of the U.S. government. So it is a fundamental shift, Lolade, that we're seeing here. One from, please get the vaccine. Here are employment-based incentives, such as paid time off to go get the vaccine or other schemes that employers employed, to a more top-down approach where the U.S. government is now providing for a mandatory scheme for sizable employers of 100 or more employees. And it's going to be very, very interesting to see how that rolls out. There are a lot of questions that are unanswered so far in the executive order, such as who pays for the vaccines? What do you do about time off for people that are going to get the vaccines? Who pays for the weekly testing? Is the time spent getting weekly testing part of employment income? Are you to be paid by the employer for that time? And so there's going to be a lot of detail that is going to roll out hopefully in the month of October. That's what we're anticipating if we follow the normal cycles in U.S. policy, where the relevant agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, is the agency that's responsible for issuing these rules, would issue the rules subject to comment and then final publication, where they would become required to be followed by U.S. workers. The reaction by U.S. employers has been mixed, as you might expect. Some like it, some don't. Anecdotally, my experience with our clients has been that it's welcome. It's a welcome change. I think that employers in the U.S. have had a frustrating time with attracting workers. Voluntary unemployment is high. Trying to get people to work in the U.S. right now, particularly in jobs that are not amenable to remote work, is very, very challenging. The cost of wages has more than doubled in a lot of more frontline occupations, making it almost impossible for employers. And so they've been very hesitant to try to create any kind of barrier like a vaccine requirement, because it's going to further discourage employees from coming to work. And so for that reason, I think a lot of employers have seen some relief, or are feeling some relief, that they don't have to be the ones that are mandating it. They can point to the federal government and say, the federal government's mandating it, so it's not something we're doing. So it's a very interesting time in the U.S. As it is globally. But that's the overall landscape that we're seeing right now: rapid change and a shift to mandating that employees get vaccinated. So using the employment sector as a means to force vaccination in the states.
Interesting. Thanks very much, Todd. That I have so many questions, but I'm not going to hog the microphone. I'm still looking at the Q&A box. I don't see much there, so that gives us, the panelists, an opportunity to ask questions of our own. But before I throw the floor open to your co-panelists to ask questions, Todd, it's interesting that even within the United States, you have different attitudes, in different geographical locations within the country. Because the question I was going to ask is that, given what you know of the current policy proposal, because it's still a proposal, isn't it? Is this something that could potentially affect subsidiaries of US companies in cross-border jurisdictions, for instance. So if you have a Nigerian subsidiary of a US company, and assuming this proposal goes through and it becomes the law that every US company must enforce, would that enforcement transcend the borders of the jurisdictional borders of the United States? And would subsidiaries of such companies in countries like Nigeria, for instance, suddenly would need to mandate that all their employees get vaccinated?
That's a great question, and certainly this policy shift that President Biden has announced, it appears to be a train that's left the station. We haven't gotten to the destination yet, but I do think that this is going to become the law in the states in short order. So I think that employers now have to start preparing for that and start addressing how they're going to handle that. In terms of multinational companies, it creates a very interesting management dilemma. How do you treat employees outside of the states when you've got specific policies within the states? And the reverse is true. I mean, I do a lot with multinational companies that are seeking to come to the states and open up an office, and they struggle significantly with how do they merge U.S. policy with their own corporate culture and their own policies. U.S. law, as it exists now, would not have control over a Nigerian subsidiary. So this policy would not be able to reach across the ocean and touch the Nigerian subsidiary in this hypothetical. But nonetheless, I think market pressures and so forth, particularly as we've gotten more, more global during the pandemic. I mean, the fact that I'm sitting here in Memphis, Tennessee, having the opportunity to speak with you and your group today shows how small the world has gotten, and it's not gonna go away. I mean, this is a blessing, for us all to have these communication tools, and those communication tools, I think, are going to change the way management is handling cross-national policies in trying to equalize them and decide, if it's a one-size-fits-all approach or what local color you're going to provide for different locations around the world. We even see that here in the States, where you've got corporations that have operations in multiple U.S. states. And each state has its own set of policies and procedures. And that's one of the remote work issues that a lot of employers have had to deal with, is how do you handle those issues with employees having been dispersed all over the place in trying to comply with all the local laws here in the States. But it will be interesting times. The takeaway, though, for the audience is that U.S. policy cannot reach you outside of the U.S. As a legal matter, but as a policy matter, I think that companies are going to have to think about that in terms of how do they address local variances in the law.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. And I think that's a very useful point for some of our viewers here today. Because we do have in the audience people who work in US multinational companies and who are concerned about this, again, because the attitudes vary from one end of the spectrum to the other, as it is in other jurisdictions as well. So just to say then, ask Todd, that health and safety now appears to be all about vaccines. What other developments have occurred in the post-pandemic era in relation to matters of health and safety in the workplace, and how can organizations address their minds to these issues when developing a policy?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, certainly, and I'd like to say that in the U.S. we're in a post-pandemic world, but I think the reality is while things opened back up, so to speak, in May and June, the Delta variant came through and shut us all back down again to a large extent. So we find ourselves back in back in the pandemic world, in our hospitals are really struggling to keep up with patient load. So we feel like in the States we're starting to cycle through a lot of that, but that has, although people in the summer started to put away the masks, and the policy in the U.S., while not a legal policy, the policy that was espoused by President Biden and the Centers for Disease Control and so forth was that if you were vaccinated, you did not have to wear a mask. Once the Delta variant came back through, masking again became something that would be recommended. There's no federal or national mask mandate, but different locations in the U.S. are still requiring masks. And that varies very much by locality. So, for example, where I am in Memphis, there is a city-based mask mandate that if you're indoors anywhere, whether you're working or you're going to a retail establishment, you have to wear a mask. If you left Memphis and stayed in the state of Tennessee, but went to the other side of the state, there is no mask mandate and nobody wears a mask. And it's very, very culturally driven on a local level, and it's very, very interesting. So in terms of employer best practices, I think it changes significantly. That's what we learned over the summer. We all became very, very comfortable in May and June of not wearing masks to work in the States. And if you were vaccinated, and most employers adopted those types of policies in order to encourage people to return to the office. So that if you were vaccinated, you didn't have to wear a mask. Fast forward, a few weeks and the Delta variant hits, and that all changed, and the majority of employers started to again require masks, even if you weren't, or even if you were vaccinated, rather. There's still, the concept of social distancing. If you are in a workplace that has high contact with the general public, so if you're a clerk in a store, for example, we're still seeing a lot of plexiglass barriers at the checkout stations, where you may be checking out the grocery store or some other establishment, and that sort of thing. So the rules are not nearly as draconian as they were in the early days of the pandemic, but I think we're learning to live with the virus, so to speak. But certainly, everyone's mind is on making sure we're all staying healthy, and masking up has been the primary tool for that.
Thanks very much indeed, Todd. Useful tips also for our attendees, especially compliance managers and staff who are tasked with the responsibility of drawing up these policies. So now I want us to ask questions across the floor, and I'll start with you, Todd, because I came to you the last, so you get to be the first to ask a question. So please feel free to direct questions at any of your co-panelists, whether on succession planning or remote working, or if you want to share your perspectives to what's been said already.
Sure. So I am curious about the remote work issue and how that's being addressed in a little bit more detail. One of the things that we discovered in the U.S. is that employers didn't know where their employees were, and then that resulted in some kind of after the fact headaches for employers from a tax perspective and from a regulatory perspective. And so employers are starting to adopt more formal policies in terms of how do they handle remote work, whether they allow it or not, and shifting attitudes and patience for remote work as everyone's trying to get people back to the office. But I'm curious from a policy perspective, what other parts of the world are seeing in terms of drafting policies for employers on remote work.
Natalia, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So I guess what we're seeing here in Europe, and it connects really much to what Todd said, is we're not seeing so much. So to put it in perspective, we're not seeing so much vaccine mandates, but more of a way to incentivize people to get vaccinated. So for instance, in Europe, you have this requirement that in order for you to be able to go to a restaurant, a bar, cinemas, etc., mostly anywhere, you need to have, they call it the 3G. So in German is a G, but it's, you need to be vaccinated, tested, or you need to prove that you already have immunity if you got COVID at some point. So now what they're doing is, and this was a really successful case in France, actually. So they had a really high percentage of the population that did not want to get vaccinated. And then they came up with this policy saying, it's fine if you don't want to get vaccinated, but you know, you would have to either keep doing tests, and at some point this is going to be at your expense, because right now the tests are free here in Europe, but they're not going to be free forever, is what we're seeing. Or you need to get vaccinated. And then in like 2 months, the percentage of people that didn't want to get vaccinated, you know, went down a lot. So these are probably other ways to ensure that policy. But what we're seeing also in terms of remote working, I think most employees would like to have a flexibility and the possibility to remote work from home sometimes or elsewhere, or go to the office. From the side of the employers, to be honest, I haven't seen that many, or at least explicit, remote working policies yet, because I do feel like there's an idea for employees, to return to the office as soon as it's allowed. So, you know, I can tell you based on my experience, both on a private company I was working before or at the university I am right now, there's a preference for us to go back in person, even though, you know, it becomes a discussion on productivity or collaboration with your colleagues, or also junior members of the team. So maybe if you're more of a senior member, you already have your network established, you have probably a really good house with a good office to work from home. But maybe if you're more on the side of a junior position, then I don't know, maybe you have roommates, you don't have the ideal place to work. And yeah, or even situations where you have kids. So this is also something that plays a role, we're seeing, for you to be at home or not. Maybe you can focus better at the office than at home. So yeah, I think it is still a pretty much unique environment we're living in. What we're seeing is that we're trying to fit this new reality into the framework we already have. And then you have countries like Finland that, for instance, they, even before the pandemic, they already had a culture of remote working. So they have a law that allows for the employees to work from home half of the week, which is great. And what you need to take into account, I saw some questions that came up regarding mental health, etc. So I think we are all feeling that, because we're not just here discussing, we're also discussing from a practical perspective. So when you work from home, you tend to work even longer hours, you tend to be available even longer hours. So some measures that maybe could really benefit the mental health of your employees is to set a specific time where you expect that person to be available, where you expect that person to be responsive, and to really encourage your employees to try to have a limit between your work and personal life.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Natalia. I want to throw that question open to other panelists as well. Someone's asking what employers can do to help employees manage mental health issues. Any tips would be useful. And also someone is asking about boosting productivity. So from an experiential point of view, what tips can we share with attendees on these two issues?
I'm definitely not an authority on mental health and how to, deal with that. But I think it is incredibly important for employers to communicate and to have open channels, and for employees to feel heard. So it is important that employees know that, whenever they need to talk, they can do that, and that there are people that would be able to have those discussions with them. we in South Africa have these concepts of employee assistance programs that employers sign up for, and that gives employees access to counselors, for example.
Talita, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Still
No?
can't hear you.
I can hear Talita.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so it must be my internet. Apologies. Talita, please go on.
No, I'm just saying that through employee assistance programs, there might be access to counselors, and it is important that employees are reminded that they must access those services and, if need be, get professional help from a doctor. These are unprecedented times, and no one will think that you are a weak person or anything like that. It is important, that we communicate this to our team members. A couple of years ago, I was faced with a situation like that, and it is absolutely amazing what the right interventions can do. And yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Talita. Does anyone want to comment, ask a question in relation to any of the policies we've discussed?
And I ask Dan, please. Dan said that he's not that much for hard regulation, and rather for soft touch regulation. And I think that I agree with that. But in relation to succession planning, we have in South Africa an added layer of complexity, and that relates to our history and the restitutionary measures that employers are supposed to implement in the form of affirmative action, for example. And it also includes non-discrimination principles. So an employer isn't permitted to unfairly exclude people on the basis of race or sex or religion or whatever ground. And I was just wondering how one would make sure, when you identify a candidate as the successor, that you spoke about favoritism, but how are you making sure that that process of being considered is a fair one, and that allegations of racism or sexism or unfair discrimination on the wrong grounds do not come into play?
Well, in Nigeria, we don't have the sort of regulatory sort of restrictions or prescriptions, perhaps I should say, that are driven by regulation. We simply don't have them yet. What we do have is a focus that's in part sort of focus on governance, which is a focus on gender, for instance. There's a greater focus on gender balance on the boards of listed companies. And so that focus on the boards at the top of listed companies will work its way down into the succession process, in my view. But at the moment, there's no prescription either in limited liability companies, listed companies, or indeed in law firms. It's still very much a question of applying a good dose of common sense and fairness in identifying talent generally, and in identifying successors from that talent. Now, my view actually, in relation to my view of what one should do that helps blunt suggestions of bias, is that one thinks not so much in terms of identifying an individual as a successor, at least in terms of the early to medium stages, but more in terms of developing for want a better term, a succession pool. So you know, if it's in the ranks of partnership, identifying a pool of talent within the partnership that are both. I mean, I think, quite frankly, a minimum is that if you're going to have any respect from your professional colleagues, is that you'd be a halfway decent lawyer. Otherwise, there's going to be a problem. So let's take that as a given. But then there are other skills that that are required if you're leading if you're chief executive of the law firm or managing partner, depending on what it's called, how you choose to style yourself. There are other skills that are required. And so, you know, if I were doing this from a blank sheet of paper, it would be to have a talent pool, 3, perhaps 4 people that you think could be future successors, and equip those people with these management skills, for instance, basic knowledge of accounting, so that, and this is well before the question of succession arises. So that when the question of succession does arise, it's not a question of making a decision whether or not the crown prince is going to be anointed, but making a decision as to whether or not one of 3 or 4 people will be appointed. And I think that helps to blunt this question of, I think people can live with, certainly in Nigeria, people can live with the identification of one of several. What I think people find a little bit more troublesome is where there doesn't appear to be, you know, where there's an inevitability to it. You know, I see that both in the law firm, and I also see it in the companies on whose boards I sit. That it's really important to have that pool of talent.
Thank you very much indeed. There I was in my ambitious manner, thinking we would wrap this up in an hour. We've actually spent 90 minutes and we could still go on for another 20, but we'll call it a day here. Thank you so very much. There's one question in the box that I would just quickly like to ask Todd before we close this session. And the question is, can policies or laws mandating vaccinations be regarded as breaches of employees' fundamental human rights?
That's a great question. I saw that in the box, and I'm glad that you asked it. So in the U.S., at least, the law is clear that, and there's a long history of this, that the government is free to mandate vaccination in terms of employer mandatory vaccinations to come to work. So the law is well developed in that regard. The issue with the pandemic is that until very, very recently, in the U.S., these vaccines from Pfizer, Moderna, and others that are prevalent, and Johnson & Johnson, the 3 that are prevalent in the States, they were all only approved for use in the U.S. through what's called emergency use authorization. And so there was concern among employers as to whether they could actually mandate a vaccine that was only authorized for emergency use and not given full authorization from the federal or from the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S., which regulates. Now that these vaccines have been fully approved, then that reverts back to the U.S. Well-developed law that says that employers can mandate vaccines. The 2 big caveats to that would be for individuals that have a disability, and also for individuals that may have a bona fide religious objection. So those are the 2 outlets, if you will, for people that want to avoid a mandatory vaccine. But that's what the law is. There's still a lot of debate about that, outside of the law.
Thanks very much, Todd. Things are still evolving to a very large extent, but I want to thank all the panelists today for the perspectives you've shared. We hope our attendees have found the discussions interesting and useful. As I said, this is a series of webinars, and we have another session holding same time next week. Please look out for the details in your email boxes and on our social handles. And if there are any other questions for the panelists, please send us an email at iceteam@uubo.org. ICE team, TEAM as one word, @uubo.org. And we will direct your questions to the relevant panelists. Thank you so very much to our panelists. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Anumaka. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Todd. Thank you, Talita. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Mr. Agbo. And to my colleagues who are working behind the scenes, thank you very much, Jumoke. Thank you, Mrs. E. And thanks to our corporate comms team. Have a very good afternoon.